Hi, this is part two of my basic narrative concepts. And in part one, I talked about the realities, the core subgenres, and then the core genres. In this part, I'll be talking about plot, theme, characters, and basic terms. In the term section, I might be talking about stuff that people already know. Sometimes I might be creating my own words depending on how far I go with it in context of my reviews. And sometimes I have a slightly different definition that most people would have for a word. Like, for example, cliche. I have a slightly different definition than most people have for the term cliche. Before I get into this video, I wanted to make some corrections from the last video because I made some mistakes. So, in the action adventure psychological horror, Hansel and Gretel, The Witch Hunters, and I Frankenstein are actually action psychological horrors. Films like Pandorum 2009 is more of an action adventure psychological horror. And in the reality section, I put Hangover 2009 as science fact when it's actually a comedy reality. So it's on the lower side of the comedy reality, but it still has a comedy reality. So therefore, The Hangover 2009 is actually a comedy, or it's a comedy reality, and also like it's a funny movie, like in the sense that it goes beyond making jokes. Like the reality in itself, like the reality itself is loony, as well as that they have jokes on top of that. So without further ado, I'll get into part two of my basic narrative concepts. And this is in context of like when I review like films or anything that has a heavy narrative. So this can also incorporate video games, but this is mainly for the film reviews I'll be making, or maybe books, but this is mainly for films. But this can be applied to anything with a narrative. The first topic I want to talk about is plot, and the definition of a plot is as follows. It's the believed desired end result of the narrative character's perspective to resolve their major problem. So keep in mind, plot is in the perspective of the narrative character and how to solve their major problem or problems. So keep in mind, it's in the character's perspective, not yours or not someone else's. So that's what makes plot unique, because it's about the narrative character's perspective on how to solve a problem. It may not be the correct way, it might not be the most efficient way, but in the narrative character's eyes, that is the best way. And the next topic I'll be talking about is story versus plot. So basically, this is character development versus character problems. Story is basically events organized by time, i.e., the physical journey, a sequence of events in the way it happened according to the character being followed, including the turning points, their experience. Plot is events organized by logic, i.e., the significance of the journey, a sequence of events that either explains why something happened in the way it happened, outcome, or is arbitrary yet coherent, turning points. So keep in mind, story is about everything. It's just that it's organized by time. So maybe in a narrative, there's something called story weaving. So basically, think of story weaving like mixing up the time sequences. So maybe you might see the ending of a narrative first, and then it flashes back to the beginning of how everything led up to the ending, kind of thing. You don't see the conclusion, but you see like the almost the climax. You basically reach the climax at the beginning of the narrative, but then before that climax is almost over or it's finished, you flash back to the beginning. And they might be flip-flopping. They might have sequences back as a child and then go into present time, and then they might go in the future. So that's what story weaving is about. And then when you want to cipher a story, you organize everything by time. And then with plot is basically points in the time sequence that creates significance within the journey. So think of it like an outcome of what happened about something, or a turning point, and that's basically what plot is about. So maybe plot might take something from the childhood of the character, correlating to something that happened in the present time that correlates to something that happens in the future. So it's just piecing together the logic within the story. And then the story itself is making sure you organize the events by time. It may not be presented in chronological order, but if you want to cipher out a story, you cipher out the story by time, so from the beginning to end. So even if it's not presented that way, you organize it in that fashion. And then with the plot, you you piece together the logic within that story. So now the next thing I'll be talking about is elements of a plot, which consists of 4 subtopics to this. Basically is acts, events, sequences, and scenes. So acts are plot-based. This deals with the genre-based perspectives. So if you're talking about the action genre, it's about proficiency or ability. And if you're talking about action-adventure, it's about the cosmos, space, and time, and the ability or like proficiency. So keep that in mind. It's genre-based perspectives. The next one is events, which is turning points. And I have event as an occurrence. And occurrence is basically triggers and resolutions, meaning like something is like a start and end of something, but it's caused purposefully by someone or something. And they generally time-sensitive incidents. And sometimes an event, it just happens organically in the environment. It wasn't intentional, but maybe the habits of the characters in the narrative somewhat created their own problems. Like maybe, for example, they might show a scene at work and their work environment is messy, and then it creates an accident. They may have not, maybe the intent of the characters wasn't to create an accident or cause an accident, but their behavior somewhat triggered an event. So basically think of this kind of event organic. So it doesn't happen purposefully. It just happens because maybe another person intervened or whatever. Like you don't intentionally try to cause problems or create a cause and effect. It just happens naturally. And the trigger resolution is basically someone purposefully trying to do something, or they trigger an event purposefully. And yeah, that'll be the difference. The next subtopic would be sequences. This is theme-based. This deals with the variation of the topic, the concerns, perspective of the narrative characters, the build-up, the exposition, the making the audience believe, and the downtime. So what I mean by topic, it can be one of 3 things. Someone can be on topic, out of context, or in context, off topic, or in context and on topic. So when someone's in context and on topic, they're talking about the situation and focusing on the perspective of the person going through the situation at that time. This is usually the person who brings up the situation, and you focus on them. So you're being in context and on topic. So, for example, it might be about abuse in a relationship, and the topic might be, when did this start? Kind of thing. And then someone who is on topic but out of context, they might be talking about, let's say there's 2 characters, and one of them brings up abuse in their situation, but then all of a sudden the character they're talking to only correlates that situation to something else, but more about them. So maybe one character has abuse, talking about abuse in a relationship, and then the other character might be talking about their personal experiences with abuse. So it might be something completely different. So they might be talking about online abuse, where they talk about like video games or something different, but still on topic. But they're not in context, because context will be about the situation that brought up or triggered the topic. So that means they're out of context, but on topic, because they're talking about their personal experiences. But if you're in context, that means you have to talk about the people involved in the current situation. So if you're out of context, you're talking about a different situation with different people. It could be the same. It could be the same people, but in a different situation. But at the moment, if you're out of context, that means you're not talking about that particular instance with the individuals involved. So therefore, you're out of context, and you're talking about a completely different scenario. So when you're in context, you're talking about the people involved and the particular instance that these people were interacting and how they were interacting. So if you're responding to someone in context, you have to respond to them in the sense that the people being involved in that particular instance of when that particular event happened. And when someone's off topic and out of context, so for example, if the first person brought up abusive relationships and the second person brought up video games, and they continue to talk about their experiences playing online, and they talk about how someone's always talking about smashing their mom, stuff like that, and how do they overcome that. Yes, they're talking about, it's somewhat related, but it's out of context and off topic. So keep that in mind. You can be on topic, out of context, in context, off topic, or in context and on topic. Hopefully that wasn't confusing, but context means situation, and topic means the perspective or experiences about the person in that particular situation. So if you want to be in context and on topic, you talk about the situation that the person brings up and the perspective or experiences about the person who brought up that situation. So it's about the character who brings it up. Before I leave context versus topic, even though context generally means situation, but it could also mean scenario. So someone can bring up a scenario, so it could be hypothetical, and someone can ask a question that's correlating to the scenario, so that'll be the topic. So let's say, for example, you're in like a rehab group, and then the topic would be addiction. So the topic would be addiction, and then people will bring their own perspectives of addiction in that meeting. So the context of each individual will be different, but the topic will be the same for everyone. So if the topic is addiction, then the context will change because each person's experiences may be different. Maybe addiction may be with someone's significant other, while addiction may be someone within the family. So the context will change, but the topic remains the same for everyone. So the perspective is unique, but the context changes. And it can be vice versa. So maybe it might be a scenario where they create where it say someone in the family is addicted. So that'll be the context. Then the topic would be the person's perspective when dealing with that kind of scenario when someone has addiction in the family. And maybe the whole group is about family addiction or addiction in the family. So the context will not change for anyone, just the perspective of each person's experience with addiction within the family. And then also perspective. I have a bullet point for perspective, which correlates to the first point. But yeah, that's self-explanatory. And then there's also build up I have here. Build up just basically means like you can't always have action scenes. Action scenes in the sense that having adrenaline or exciting moments in the narrative, sometimes you have to slow down things, or sometimes you want to build up to something else, or build up to something if it's just the beginning. Exposition just basically means extra information that doesn't necessarily affect what's going on, but it can help the audience understand better. And overall, sequences helps the audience believe, and this is the downtime. So since you can't always have action scenes, action in the sense that making something exciting in the narrative, an exciting point, so you can't always have exciting point after exciting point. Well, technically you can, I'll talk about it later, but it's different. It's a different kind of tempo, And generally you want some kind of downtime. And even with action narratives, there is downtime. So keep that in mind. There's always going to be downtime, or they should be downtime, or it can create something else, which I'll talk about later on. So sequences is basically downtime, making the audience believe, exposition, the build up, and deals with the variations of the topic, or i.e. the concerns. The context is the situation, and the topic is the perspective or experiences of the character going through the situation. And lastly is scenes. This is character turning points. So this is something I created. So like there's turning points in, like, for example, in the narrative, like turning points in the sense that the direction of the narrative is changing. And then I consider character turning points where a character or in the narrative internally changes. So I have here describing the changing of narrative characters, and the bullet points for this is basically motivation, methodologies, means of evaluation, and purpose. So motivation is their drive. Methodology is how they go about achieving their goals. Means of evaluation is how they assess their progression, and purpose is why they're doing it. And the second bullet point is character development, which is straightforward. So basically the first point goes into what the character is about and how you develop the character, and that would be the 4 perspectives. If you want to create a character that's more human, so these are the basic perspectives to have in each narrative for each character if you want them to be more fleshed out. Every character in a narrative has motivation, methodologies, means of evaluation, and purpose. It may not be in the perspective you would like, or it may not be in the perspective of the primary character, but every character in a narrative will have this if they want them to be more human-like, or more relatable, or more understanding, or more logical of how they're in the narrative. So motivation is their drive. Methodologies is how they go about achieving their goals. Means of evaluation is how they assess their progression, and purpose is why. The next subtopic I'll be talking about is character to plot relations. So this is theme to plot. And later on I'll talk about why it's theme to plot, not character to plot. But right now it's character to plot relations. And the subcategories for this, or subtopics for this, is goals, requirements, consequences, forewarnings, dividends, costs, prerequisites, and preconditions. Goals is the desired end result of the primary character's perspective. Requirements, what is needed for the journey's completion. Consequences, state worse than the current state. So if something happens in the journey, what would make the current state worse? Or what will make it worse than the current state? Forewarnings, determine how close the consequences are to being forced. So maybe in the narrative, they're going through the narrative, and at some point, maybe they're using a sword, and each time they use a sword, their health deteriorates, and that will determine a state, how close you are to getting that a state worse than the current state. So it might be death, for example. Maybe the more you use a particular weapon in the narrative, the more your health deteriorates, and you might lose your life, you might lose your legs or something. Dividends, this is the journey rewards. So generally speaking, in every narrative, the narrative characters tend to get rewarded throughout the journey, or at least some point in the journey. They get something that they wanted or desired throughout the journey, and that's something typical you see in narratives. And there's costs, what is being sacrificed or put on the line. So generally speaking, with every narrative, the characters have something that they may lose throughout this journey. So this is what makes it more exciting. So you're not gonna make a narrative about someone's everyday life. It's gonna be about a particular moment in their life when something changes dramatically. So therefore, it makes it more exciting. So the narrative is not going to be about their everyday life. It's going to be about something that doesn't usually happen as frequently, but in this particular moment, their life has changed and it went in this direction. And if they keep going in that direction, things will change permanently, or some things will be put on the line. So maybe someone's girlfriend gets kidnapped or something. If you want to, that doesn't happen to everyone. Usually people break up, but if someone's girlfriend gets kidnapped, then it's up to the maybe girlfriend or boyfriend, depending on their sexual orientation. They'll have to risk something, maybe their life, in order to save their significant other. So something like that is generally what happens in every narrative. And then there's prerequisites, what is needed for the journey. Sometimes the characters are not ready for the journey, or sometimes something new happens. Maybe they're well experienced, but with this particular narrative, maybe the protagonist has an upper hand. So therefore, usually in every narrative, the protagonist tends to be a slight disadvantage than than the antagonist. So therefore, sometimes, or in most narratives at least, the protagonist needs something to make the journey more favorable in for them. So maybe they need to train more. Like for example, Karate Kid. Karate Kid, he wasn't into karate. He doesn't know anything about karate. But in that narrative, the character had to learn certain aspects of karate to even have a fighting chance with people who have been practicing karate since they were younger. So that would be like an example of a prerequisite, like in Karate Kid. Like you didn't know much karate, but you need to learn something in order to defend himself against the protagonist. So therefore, he had to learn the antagonist's weakness in order to have a fighting chance as a protagonist in the narrative. For example, with the Karate Kid, I just want to mention that it may not be the perfect example, but because of the rating, it's family oriented. So therefore, you can't let it be too realistic because it's about keeping people's morale up, and especially if someone's going through hard times, like say, for example, bullying, the narrative is supposed to help people be motivated in facing the bullies despite their disadvantage. So therefore, in family-oriented movies or films or narratives, it tends to be more cliche. So therefore, despite the Karate Kid not knowing too much karate when starting out and facing against all these people who know so much karate, it's supposed to give hope to people who have been bullied. So therefore, the narrative's rating also takes precedence on how the narrative unfolds. If it's too raw, too real, especially with such a low rating, it can deter the targeted audience. The last one is preconditions, what is needed in the journey to acquire the prerequisite. So let's say, for example, in Karate Kid, in order for the Karate Kid to beat up his bully, he needs to find a teacher. And then once he finds a teacher, then the prerequisite for the journey would be to train. So the precondition is acquiring something in the journey so you can obtain the prerequisite. Or maybe in the journey you need a vehicle, but you need someone who can find a vehicle. So maybe you need to invite your friend Bob or something, and then Bob can acquire the vehicle for you, the prerequisite for the journey. So the precondition is just something in the journey that is needed in order to acquire the prerequisite for the journey. So just a quick recap: goals, requirements, consequences, forewarnings, dividends, costs, prerequisites, and preconditions. Now the next topic I'll be talking about is theme. The definition of a theme is as follows. It's the relationship the narrative character has with the plot. The narrative character's perspective is seen through the theme to comprehend the plot. So this is why plot seems to be so different for everyone. People will say that plot is the general theme, which is true, but then people will also say that it's your perspective, what you take of the story, And to be more objective, you need to take the perspective of the narrative characters, or the characters in the narrative. So, so this will be the relationship they have with the plot. So this is why it can be so different for everyone, because they're taking it from perspectives. And think of theme, or the relationship between character to plot, or the character to plot would be how something is different or unique. So there can be like 10 love stories, but the characters in the narrative will have different perspectives of love, therefore making it unique. So the idea you can't copyright, but the expression of an idea what makes something unique. Think of it like a vehicle. There can be thousands of vehicles, but an expression of a vehicle, like a brand, but then you can't copyright the whole industry, but you can copyright a certain expression of something in that industry, or in that sector of market, or in the market sector. Another way of putting it is idea versus expression. Think of it like Tomb Raider versus Uncharted. They both have the same idea, but their expression makes it unique. Now that I established that theme is the relationship between character and plot, so therefore theme is about perspective. And there's about 4 perspectives that theme can take hold, or theme overall has within the narrative. So with theme, it's all about perspective. So the subtopic for this is perspectives. And since theme is about the relationship between character and plot, there can be various perspectives or various relationships that characters can have with the plot. And these 4 different perspectives are as follows: action, story, or main character perspective, the reason why the story is being told, the narrative focus, the passive or primary character perspective, the perspective of the character telling the story, the impact or fixed attitudes perspective. These are the perspectives of the characters that have the ability to help or hinder the main character, which is the action perspective. And then the last one is subjective or relationship perspective, or the personal psychological perspective. And these are all the sub storylines, like the B, C, D, E, and the primary and main character relationships with the secondary characters. So basically, this is like assessing the relationship or the personal relationship with each characters, mainly with the primary and main character. So going over again, it's action perspective, which is the main character perspective, which is what the story is about, the narrative focus. The passive or primary character perspective, it's told through the eyes of this character, the story. So when you're watching a movie, this is the passive perspective, but keep in mind that the passive and action perspective can be one perspective. And then there's the impact perspective. And I have fixed attitudes here because these characters are generally the secondary characters, and they tend to have fixed attitudes. These characters don't necessarily change too much unless the whole point of the narrative is to change other people. But in generally speaking, these characters have fixed attitudes, so they're stuck in their ways essentially, and these people tend to question the primary or the main character, mostly the main character, because that's what the narrative focus is about. So the impact characters tend to try to challenge whether it's to help or hinder the main character. And then the last one is the subjective or relationship perspective. And basically, sometimes when in a narrative, something happens with the primary character, and with the secondary characters, it can create subplots within the narrative because of their perspective. They have the fixed attitude perspectives, and then there's the action perspective, basically where the action perspective is like what the narrative is about. So therefore, it's a lot more intense. It's probably the best perspective, or the perspective that most people would want to see the narrative being told. And keep in mind that the primary and main character relationships with the secondary characters are also associated with this perspective, which is the subjective perspective. So keep in mind that theme is all about perspective, but all about the narrative characters' perspectives in relationships to the plot. So secondary characters tend to have fixed attitudes, which is the impact character perspective, and how the story is being told is generally the passive perspective, which can also be the passive and action perspective. And then also the action perspective is what the narrative is about, the narrative focus. And then the fourth one is just basically the relationships. So keep in mind that's what theme is about. It's about perspective, but mainly focusing on the narrative character's perspective or the characters in the narrative's perspectives. Just before I leave this topic, I just want to emphasize that the primary character is what the story is about, and the main character is basically how the story is being told, like the perspective of how the story is being told. And generally, those two can be one, but keep in mind they're generally two separate entities or two separate concepts within the narrative. I'll be talking about this more so in the character section, but I just want to emphasize it at the end of this section because they sort of correlate together. So keep in mind the primary character is what the story is about. The main character is in the perspective of the story, like how the audience is experiencing the story. But those two can be one, but keep in mind they're generally separate entities or separate concepts. Now starting a whole new topic, characters. And within the character section, I'll be talking about character progression dimensions, character development dimensions, and character types. And then I'll go into complex / character crossover cast and how to decipher that, or how I decipher them. It may not be the standard way of deciphering characters in a narrative, but it's my way of doing it. So the first subtopic I want to get into is character progression dimensions, and there are 4 progression dimensions that I have, and they are as follows: motivation, evaluation, methodology, and purpose. Motivation is the narrative character's force, i.e. their drive. Evaluation is a narrative character's standards to measure progress. Methodology is a narrative character's means of getting what they want, i.e. the how. And purpose is a narrative character's direction. So with these 4 dimensions, this is what most narratives would need in order to have a fleshed out cast or characters within the narrative to be more human-like. So if they have these 4 dimensions, they're set. But I take it to the next level, which I have character development dimensions. And with this section, I have about 5. And the 5 are as follows: personality, baseline development dimension, perspective or meaning dimension, or intelligence or external dimension, experience or nurture dimension, and behavioral, controlled or performance dimension. So with the personality or baseline or development dimension, what correlates to this is behavioral. This is demeanor. Intellect is development. Emotion is reaction. Nature, genetic. State, view or mood. And language or philosophy. The reason why language is here because language somewhat dictates how a person thinks. So think of it like having an object, and in one language it can mean one thing, in another language it can mean another. So, and sometimes in how someone speaks in another language can be different. In English, they tend to have more words. Maybe in French, they don't have that particular word, so they have to improvise or try to use words that are available in the vocabulary in order to name something. So therefore, you think differently. You can only use words that are available within the language. You can't really make up any new words. But in English, it's slightly different. English tends to somewhat create more words. For some reason, they always create new words. But in other languages, they don't tend to do that. So the second dimension I have here is meaning or perspective. And what correlates to this is views. And what correlates to views is likes and dislikes. So independent from the views is beliefs, values, flashbacks, which is another way of saying disassociated meaning, mental attachment, identity, fears, and then language again comes up. So it's like the native language what creates the baseline. So think of it like the object thing. Maybe in English we call video game consoles, but in another language they call them systems or something. So think of it that way. So they have, each language will create different meanings or slight variations of the same meaning because of the vocabulary that are available within that language, and sometimes on how you talk in that language can also dictate how you think. Like in French, sometimes, from my understanding, they somewhat use mathematics to say their numbers, while in English we do not use that. So they might say like 50 times 3 or something. I don't know, or whatever. They somewhat use math when saying their numbers, while in English we don't do that. The next one I have is intelligence or external. So what correlates to this is comprehension, and what correlates to comprehension is use of information and influences of the environment. When what's independent from comprehension is progression, and what correlates to progression is openness and growth. So keep in mind, intelligence is measured by not how much you don't know, but how well do you know the stuff you do know. Like, how deep can you go into the information that you already do know, or the concepts you already know. So think of it like, if someone is able to read, how advanced or how in depth can they go with the reading, or if they're able to comprehend a concept, how far can they take that concept, and how far can they take that particular concept. So basically, intelligence is measured by how well you know the stuff you know, and not so much about how much you don't know. It's about what you know and how deep can you take that concept, or how far can you take that single concept or the concept you already know. So basically, the more you know, and if you're like really intelligent, meaning that you're able to take concepts really far. So the more you know, the more deeper you can get into something. So intelligence is not about how much you don't know, but how well do you know the things you already do know. So the next dimension I have here is experience, which is nurture. And under this, we'll have environment, events, and limitations, or familiarity. So under environment, what associates to that is a physical association and physical attachment. Independent from that, which is environments, what's associated to environments is trauma, when thought is treated like an experience. So basically, when someone has trauma, it generally means that when they remember something that was traumatic, the mind confuses the memory as an experience. So therefore, the body reacts to the memory as if it's happening now. So therefore, that's what trauma basically is. It's more of a mental state, and how the mind is confusing a memory as an experience. And the next independent concept under experience is limitation or familiarity. And what associates to this is bias. This dimension is not fully developed, but keep in mind, I have this here to get an idea of what this dimension is heading in, what direction it's heading in. And the last dimension is behavioral, controlled, or performance. And under this, what's associated with this is social distinction, mannerisms or habitual, emotions, regulation, and identity as performance. So under social distinction, what correlates to this is comfort socialization. This is like the introvert, extrovert kind of concepts. And then going back to the independent concepts associated with behavioral or performance is identity. And I have identity as performance because, generally speaking, people will identify or classify people based on how they act. So therefore, someone might say, act like a man, or you throw like a girl. These terms are associating to someone's performance. So therefore, if they're acting like a sissy, they're saying that they're acting like a female. If you throw funny, they're saying you throw like a girl. So that means they're implying basically males and females throw differently based on how they perform. So therefore, generally speaking, identity is seen as performance. Same thing with transgenders. When they believe that they don't belong with the gender that they were born with, or the gender categorization that they were born with. So therefore, they try to change their function in order to fulfill their needs as the opposite gender. So therefore, that's why they have like their hormones and the deeper voice and the look or shorter hair and etc. Because basically they're trying to perform as a male as well, try to have that male binary function. So there can be a binary identity and there's like a performance identity, but I find that the performance identity takes more precedence than anything else, despite your genetic identity, I guess. And before I close this section off, I want to say that development is the process of seeing one point to another. The next topic I'll be talking about is types of characters. The subtopics for this is overview of character design, complex characters, primary characters, secondary characters, and main characters. So the first thing I'll get into is an overview of character design. So with basic character design, there's always a counter character or a counter personality type for each attribute a narrative character has. So think of it like a protagonist versus antagonist, emotional versus reason, attacker versus defender. So there's always a counter personality type with each narrative. So maybe in a narrative, the leader might want to attack all the time, but then another character may want to always think things through. So maybe the leader likes to jump into things without thinking, while someone else doesn't like to do that. So there's always someone there challenging a character, and the way they think is slightly different. The order in which their character attributes are organized will determine what they see is more important. Maybe someone maybe put emotions in a back burner. So everyone has emotions, everyone has reason, everyone may want to attack, everyone may want to defend, but depending on the order of the character attributes, they will be defined as an attacker because that's what they mainly do. They take attacking, taking more precedence over defending. So someone who's a defender will take defending, taking more precedence than attacking, even though they will attack at some point, but it's what the order of their attributes of each character and how they see things will be determined by the order of their attributes. Complex characters. These are the narrative characters that have conflicting core personality attributes, making them appear more developed than one-sided characters. Because of the conflicting internal battles they have, you can make them appear more human-like. If a narrative character's core attribute is logic, they shouldn't be using emotions to making decisions, creating an internal personality conflict. This is generally the methodologies of a character not being consistent and sometimes having characters with opposite core personality attributes. So mainly when characters are conflicting in a narrative, it's usually the methodology dimension that are conflicting. But then with complex characters, they have conflicting methodologies within that same character. So basically, it's almost like they're battling themselves with different characters. It's almost like having two different characters into one. It's like having a more dominant logical person in one character, and then a slightly less dominant emotional character in the same character. So with these characters, they'll have different methodologies of getting their goals or working towards their goals. So with that character dimension, usually it's the methodology that makes the character more complex. If they have internal conflicting attributes, they will have the character dimension of methodology being conflicting. They will have conflicting character dimensions within the one character. The next three I'll just talk as one. So there's primary character, main character, and secondary character. The primary character is the perspective of the narrative and can be independent from the narrative focus. The main character is what the narrative is about, the narrative focus. And the secondary character, it's all the other characters in the narrative to help flesh out the main character throughout the narrative. So when someone's telling a story, there's always one perspective, and that'll be the primary character. There cannot be two perspectives. If there's two perspectives, that means there's two different stories. And usually when there's two different stories, it's usually a subplot. So like maybe in a narrative, there's the main plot, and then something happens that triggers a subplot. Maybe a secondary character starts doing their own thing, and the narrative somewhat flip flops. Or maybe like the movie VHS. Basically, they're telling three different stories, and then they have one overall arcing story. So for example, in the movie VHS, they have three different stories being told, and then they have an overall arcing story. So basically, the main premise is to sneak into a building or into someone's place and get this right VHS tape. I don't think they ever go into why they're doing it, but they do explain what they're doing. So they're going to this place and they try to get the right VHS. And over the course of them trying to get the right VHS, three movies are being played. Like, it's one of the VHSs that they put in, but they focus on three of them. They put in multiple ones, so there's time elapsing within each story, but the narrative focuses on three of the VHS tapes that they have managed to have watched. And since there's three different stories, that means there's three different primary characters, and then there's one primary character for the overall arcing story, so like the overall plot. So like the three different stories are kind of like the subplots. There is always one perspective per story. When someone's telling a story, you cannot tell it from two different perspectives. That makes no sense. So therefore, there can only be one perspective. So therefore, there can only be one primary character. And then the main character is the narrative focus, what the story is about. This sometimes can be the primary character and the main character, but keep in mind that these two can be separated. And then the secondary characters are everyone else besides the primary and main character. So if the story is making a primary character and the main character independent, then everyone else will be secondary characters. The secondary characters help flesh out the main character. So that's the only reason why they have a cast, so you can flesh out let's say for example, the lead role in a movie. All the other characters help flesh out the lead role, so you can understand the main character, not necessarily the secondary characters. So the secondary characters aren't supposed to be well developed. They can, but they don't have to, because the whole point of them being there is so you can understand the main character, so you can flesh out the main character. So sometimes I see in reviews, people will say that the secondary character that they choose, or they like in particular, wasn't fleshed out and wasn't well developed. Well, because they're probably not the main character. If the one character is fleshed out, that's the main reason, because the whole point is to flesh out the main character. The secondary characters, there can be strong secondary characters. Like, say for example, there's this TV show like Star Trek, where they have a crew, but in general, if it's a movie, those secondary characters will not be fleshed out as much if the narrative is not focusing on them. So therefore, if it's a movie, technically speaking, the secondary characters cannot be fleshed out in most cases. But if it's a TV show, there's more time. So therefore, sometimes maybe the main character can be the captain. And then maybe one of the secondary characters, when the captain was the main character, can be the main character, and then the captain can be a secondary character. So when it's a TV show, the rules somewhat change per episode, but keep in mind, every secondary character is to flesh out the main character. So you understand the main character, what the narrative focus is about. So when it comes to like TV shows, they can flip-flop the main character. So like, say for example, you're watching The Flash, but maybe this one particular episode, it might be one of the secondary characters who doesn't have powers, but admires Flash to the point where you get to see how that character is being developed. So when they have TV shows, they can develop characters more. But when it comes to movies, they kind of sometimes don't flesh out the secondary characters, because that's not the main focus. The main focus is to flesh out the main character. So keep that in mind. And the next thing I'll be talking about is complex and crossover cast. So now I'll be talking about the complex or crossover cast, and the subtopics for this is complex crossover cast breakdown, understanding the rules versus exceptions with points of view, who cares most about the long-term goal, who controls the information to move the narrative forward, who creates or is correlated to the main problems or problem in the narrative, who has the power to correct everything, whose universe is being breached and or environment. The one thing you probably will notice is that most of the topics are like questions because you basically have to break down the complex cast or crossover cast. So like the first section is basically like the breakdown, like the overview of the breakdown, and then everything else after it is like how you would break down the cast itself and put them in certain categories so you know who's fitting into what and why, or maybe not why, but who's fitting into what. The first topic, complex or crossover cast breakdown. So there's impact characters, plot characters, solution characters, theme characters, and characters environment. So this can be one or more in each category. So I'll just go through them again, but like the definition now. So the impact characters, these are the characters that have the major influences. Plot characters, these characters trigger the main plot. Solution characters, characters that are needed for the solution or to solve the problem. Theme characters, these characters' perspectives of the theme that controls more than 50% of the narrative or influences the narrative. The main character, this is usually the main character. And the last one would be character's environment. The character's main environment where most of their character development took place or takes place. So usually when there's a crossover cast, they somewhat meet in someone's universe. So maybe like say for example, in the Flash TV show, there was a teaser of the Flash going into I think it's Supergirl's universe. So basically in that adaptation, the Flash somehow goes into someone else's universe, and in that universe the Flash doesn't exist. So therefore they had some kind of way of going into another universe where is a completely different reality and different characters. Or think of it like Earth 2 in the Flash, where there's the same characters but they have different lives. So like this, the same people still exist, but they have different lives. Maybe they took different paths. So that would be like an example of a universe. And each time there's a crossover cast, someone has to break the barrier of going into another's universe or environment. So that's what I mean by this last part here, the character's environment. So the character's main environment where most of their character development took place or takes place. And one last thing I want to point out is that when you have a complex cast and you want to have that complex cast to have a lot of airtime, you assign certain characters to certain purposes within the narrative. So like there's the impact characters. So like there's these characters that necessarily change everything, but they make things difficult or they help. Like these are the characters that somewhat can help progression in the journey or hinder the progression. And then there's plot characters, meaning that what triggers the problem in the narrative kind of thing. And then there's solution characters where what characters can be used to help solve the problems. And then there's theme characters. There can be multiple themes within a narrative, but the main theme or like the main viewpoint or perspective will be the main character. And then there's the character's environment. So each character will have a purpose within the narrative. Instead of having the one character centered around the narrative, each character will have a certain purpose, kind of like worker ants. Like each character has an assigned role within the narrative, so they have a lot of airtime, but they may not be the focal point of the narrative, but they still have enough airtime where it's like they're not unnecessarily used or they're just like weaseled in kind of thing. So therefore, having these characters have certain roles or purposes within the narrative will have more airtime, at the same time may not be the focal point of the narrative or the narrative's focus. The next topic is understand rules versus exceptions with points of view. And what I have here is basically that the rules having different viewpoints means different primary characters, but with crossover cast, the exception is that the viewpoints can be used as subplots instead. So the character's perspective of the central idea, or sometimes what elements that correlate to the central idea, but right now has a back burner, kind of like what happened with the Avengers. I think Avengers, the second movie they had with Age of Ultron. I think with that one they had the stone. The stone was correlating to the plot, but then they had, I think, Thor do something on the side. So you saw his perspective of what's going on, but it became like a B story. But even though it was seen in his perspective, but it was still a B story, so it wasn't the central theme. And that would be like an example of how a perspective can be used as a B story instead of like another primary character. And also keep in mind, the stronger the secondary characters are, the slower the primary characters. So that means the slower the narrative will be, and the longer it will take for the narrative to flesh out. And this can be a case-by-case thing. So examples of crossover narratives would be Avengers, Alien vs. Predator, and Rugrats Go Wild. And what I've noticed is that there's not many crossover casts or crossover narratives, but there seem to be cameos of people or characters from other narratives coming over to another narrative, but not staying as part of the story. And I find that Avengers, Alien vs. Predator, and Rugrats Go Wild in the film industry seems to be the main films that have actually had two different narratives come together as one narrative instead of having cameos. So with Avengers, for the most part, I would say Tony Stark is the central character. He's like the main character. He's the one who glues everyone together. And then everyone else has their other roles, like maybe impact characters and stuff like that, or plot characters. And with Alien vs. Predator, this one's a little bit more simpler. So the humans, we take the in the narrative, we take the perspective of the humans, and then the predators come out of nowhere, and I think the aliens were already there on the planet, but then they're probably put there years before, and they're on the planet, and we stumble upon the aliens, and then the predators come in, and that's how it all unfolds. So the aliens are somewhat the common enemy of the predators and the humans. So that's how that narrative is told. And Rugrats Go Wild, I haven't seen this movie in a while, and from my understanding, you're taking this perspective of the Rugrats, and they're on a ship or something, and they get shipwrecked on an island where the wild thornberry is held. So therefore, the Rugrats are visiting the wild thornberry's environment, but the central theme and everything else will be on the Rugrats, because that's the characters, or those are the characters you were following prior to the incident. So therefore, the Rugrats would be the central theme. And then in that central theme, I would say, I haven't seen the film in a while, but I would say the babies are pushing the narrative forward, and I would say the Rugrats are the main pushers, and more so the bald one. I forgot the name of the bald one, and I would say that's what's pushing the narrative forward. But even though there's other characters around, the babies are the main focal point. And at this point, or this section, this is where impact characters are important, because it would classify a type of secondary character. And having impact characters means that they are important to success, but not the primary characters pushing the narrative. And impact characters are similar to having team members on a sports team. To win, roles must be fulfilled despite them not being focused on directly achieving the goal. So a goalie on the defense is important on a soccer team, but the forwards are the main focus to win, kind of thing. So keep in mind, it's kind of like a sports team. You have the goalie, defense, and then you have the forwards. The forwards are the main focal point, but you also have the other roles fulfilled, so you can flesh out the characters and somewhat move the narrative forward without having any loopholes of why something happened. So it's just basically simple explanations of why something happened, and have those characters handle the simple stuff, and the harder stuff will have like the forwards, or like the main characters, or the characters that push the narrative. Now with the next 5 topics, I'll try to push through this a little bit faster. So the next topic is who cares most about the long-term goal. Understanding which character wants to achieve the long-term goal but may not have the requirements to do so. So think of this as like the steps I was talking about earlier on, where there's requirements or like prerequisites, and then there's like preconditions. There's like a precondition is what helps you get the prerequisite in the narrative or in the journey. So like you may need someone to get something else in the narrative, so you can push forward in the journey. So that's what this is kind of like relating to. So you are trying to understand which character who wants to achieve the long-term goal the most, and but may not have the requirements to do so. So maybe someone's family may have died, but then there's other characters in the narrative that don't really care about the family. So think of it in that aspect. And the next topic would be who controls the information to move the narrative forward. Understanding who controls the narrative will be the overall main character, despite having many iconic main characters from other respectable intellectual properties or universes. So this is basically trying to cipher out who is the real main character, because there can only be one main character, because there's only, since theme is always about character to plot relation, and that usually entails one character, and there can be many characters taking on the theme, but keep in mind there's always that one character that encompasses the whole perspective or controls more so than anything else. So like say for example, in a family or in a household, a kid may think something is right, but then the parents' judgment will rule overall. So think of it in that aspect. There will be other characters with opinions, but then there will be that one character that controls everything else. It will be about that one character. It would be like almost like having your group of friends and asking for advice, but ultimately it's going to be your choice. It's your life. You're going to have to live with it. So basically think of it in that aspect. Who is going to live with the choices made at the end of the narrative kind of thing, or something like that along the lines. So keep that in mind. That's what I'm trying to convey here at this point. So I'll read it again. Understanding who controls the narrative will move the overall main character, despite having many iconic main characters from the respectable intellectual properties or universes. The next topic would be who creates and or is correlated to the main problem or problems in the narrative. So this is understanding which character is contributing to the overall main problem of the narrative, and is important because this can identify the strongest antagonist in the narrative. And knowing the strongest antagonist in an iteration of a narrative can help with the overall main character that is often the protagonist stand-in due to the main character's perspective. So sometimes when there was a crossover cast, there may be the main villain in that environment, and there'll be the main protagonist in that environment. So there'll be a main antagonist, then there'll be a main protagonist. So then, but then the narrative might be focusing on the people who came into that universe. So therefore, the person who knows that antagonist well will be the person in that universe, and the main protagonist will help the main character follow through on achieving their goals in the environment. So that'll be like the preconditioned character, and then getting the requirements from that preconditioned character to achieve their desired goal and a long-term goal within the narrative. And that can also identify the antagonist or the main antagonist, because there can be multiple antagonists as well as multiple protagonists, but then you have to cipher out what roles they have on the team in order to fulfill their goals. The next topic I have here is who has the power to correct everything. Understanding which character has the power to correct the problems is often what the narrative is about. In a narrative, it can focus on a character that is never on screen or is only on screen towards the end because part of the problem is finding them. So think of this as a preconditioned character. So maybe the whole point of the narrative or the majority of the narrative or the journey is finding that pre-character to acquire the requirement to, I guess, not acquire the requirements, but to obtain the requirements in the journey in order to fulfill the journey or to complete their journey kind of thing. So this is basically emphasizing that a character can be a precondition. And sometimes, depending on their skill set, they might be the answer to everything, despite them not really caring about the journey itself, kind of thing. And the last topic I have here is whose universe is being breached and or environment. And the point I have here is that understanding this will help with what kind of challenges and secondary characters associated to the main character, and does the reality change to incorporate the crossover. So with the reality changing, maybe it's best to have realities to not change. So therefore, maybe in one narrative, it's sci-fi, and then in another narrative, it's fantasy. Fantasy does not mean that sci-fi does not exist in that environment. It just means that there's stuff like magic in tandem of science. So science does not exist. A lot of fantasy narratives will somehow halt science for some reason, but fantasy does not mean you halt science. Fantasy just means that there are other aspects besides science being innovative or being pushed. So therefore, they can still be cars. They can still be sci-fi tech. It's just that in a fantasy world, it's just that there's magic, other things that are being pushed forward or being pushed in the sense of bettering in something other than science. So it would be like magic, for example. Maybe magic improved upon over the years as well as science, but does not mean science has a halt. So therefore, it is usually best to have the realities the same, but if the realities are different, you have to somewhat explain why something wasn't explained in the last narrative. Like, let's say, for example, why wasn't magic in the last narrative, but now it's in this narrative? So you must explain that. So it's usually best to have the realities the same than different. And this is about basically whose environment's being breached. Usually the one that's being breached, depending on the perspective, this will basically give a major hint of where the narrative is falling or who the narrative is falling. So in, like, say, Rugrats Go Wild, we're following the Rugrats breaching the Wild Thornberrys environment, and that would be an example of that. Like, you're following the Rugrats, or if you were following the Wild Thornberry, and then there's a shipwreck on the island, then even though the Rugrats are breaching the Wild Thornberry's environment, we are taking the perspective of the Wild Thornberry, but it was the other way around. We discovered them, so therefore we're following the Rugrats, and then the teams are assembled. Like the soccer team is assembled, and same thing with the antagonist team. That team's assembled. Then they fulfill their functions within the team in order to push the narrative forward, kind of thing. And that's basically it. Like, all these questions here, even though I consider them topics, or I'm referring to them as topics, they're more as questions because you have to somewhat put characters in a function and see what they fulfill in that narrative in order for the narrative to be fleshed out. So keep in mind, I'll just go over a little bit. Perspective is an exception when it comes to crossover cast, because that means the perspective of the character can be leading to a subplot. And keep in mind that even though there's two or multiple protagonists, look at who is caring most about the long-term goal will most likely be the main character. And the person you're following most of the time will most likely be the primary character, if not the same character as the main character. So these are the questions you have to ask yourself in a crossover cast of why there's only one primary character, why there's only one main character, and secondary characters also entails the antagonist and the antagonist. It basically entails everyone else besides the primary and secondary characters, which can sometimes be the same character in itself. But everyone else is a secondary character, and they fulfill a function within the narrative or in the environment. And what is their function within that environment in order for the narrative to be fully fleshed out, kind of thing. And that's basically it for this section. And the next section will be basic terms and concepts. Before I get into the terms and concepts, I will just basically quickly go through Captain America Civil War and where do the characters fit in. It won't be all the characters, but the major characters in that film adaptation, where do they fit in with the impact characters, plot characters, solution characters, theme characters, and characters environment. So the first part, impact characters, I would say Black Panther, Iron Man, and Colonel Helmut Zemo. Plot characters are Iron Man, Colonel Helmut Zemo. I'm not sure if I'm saying that name right. Solution characters, Winter Soldier and Captain America. Theme characters, Captain America, Iron Man, and Colonel Helmut Zemo. So theme characters, Captain America, Iron Man, and Colonel Helmut Zemo. And characters environment, Captain America and Winter Soldier. I would say the main and primary character is Captain America. And then Iron Man is like a fake antagonist in the film. And the real antagonist is Helmut Zemo. And Winter Soldier is basically fleshing out Captain America and how he is as a character. And you somewhat fleshing out Iron Man a little bit, because Iron Man is set in his ways, but then Captain America is somewhat pulled between two different worlds. So you get to see how Captain America is when he's put into a situation like this, and what does he choose? He still wants to be friends with Iron Man, but at the same time he understands that Winter Soldier may not be in control of his actions. So therefore he doesn't judge him based on what he does when he's under control, but at the same time he's drawn between two worlds. So in this narrative, it's kind of simple because in the title it says Captain America Civil War, so therefore Captain America is somewhat involved in this. So usually the title can somewhat help you out, but when there's something like Alien vs. Predator, it may be harder to decipher out with the title, but when you watch the movie, it's very simple. The humans are the main focal point, and then the predator and the aliens are the enemy. But the predators have somewhat of an intelligence, so therefore their common enemy is the alien. So that one's a little bit simple. And then same thing with Rugrats Go Wild. You're following the Rugrats crew, and then they stumble upon the Wild Thornberry crew, kind of thing. So that one's a little bit simple too. But you just have to really think about where you want to put the characters, in what order or what kind of purpose they have on the team, and what do they fulfill, and then do the review based off of that. Now for the basic terms. Since my video is so long now, I'm going to focus on 4 terms. So cliche, saturation, reboot, and spin-off. So cliche, I define cliches when events happen too perfectly, whether it's positive or negative, events without any real consequences. So think of this like Star Wars. Like when there's like a Death Star, and there's like this one spot in the Death Star, and it blows up. Same thing with Star Wars, what's it called? Star Wars 7, I think. there's like a planet, basically like the Death Star, and there's this one spot and it blows up. So if something is built and it's supposed to be so dangerous, why is there only one spot where something can blow up? That would be cliche. And usually cliche happens when the rating is low. So think of it like family oriented movies or films. They tend to be cliche because the targeted audience cannot take the realism. So therefore that it's okay to be cliche in that aspect. But when it comes to like more mature films or narratives like Star Wars, it tends to be cliche because it happens too perfectly. Like why is the Death Star? Well, I think they explained that in some kind of spin-off movie, but in general, before that even happened, and then the second one came out, the seventh movie came out, and they have the same thing. To me, I guess in general it's considered poor writing, but to me especially, it's considered poor writing because you're trying to have a very easy way to end something than to have something to be more realistic in the universe created. So cliche is when something happens too perfectly and it does seem uncanny. It doesn't seem natural. Even if the universe is not realistic in the sense of science fact, you still have to ground it in the realism of that universe, depending on the rating too. So the higher the rating, the more realistic the outcomes can be in a theoretical sense. So let's say, for example, someone has magic spells, and the consequence of a magic spell is that maybe you get deformed. But in a cliche narrative, they have to be really sorry, or maybe there's a spell out there that can reverse it. But in reality, when they tone it down more, maybe when you use that spell in the wrong way, it's permanent damage. So there's real consequences. So therefore, there's real danger. So you have to understand like the real danger of it. So when something is happening and it's so dramatic and it's supposed to be some kind of epic villain or epic consequences, the consequences have to be real. Otherwise, it tends to be cliche. So the lower the rating, the more acceptable the cliche is. But the higher the rating, the more unacceptable it is. So movies like Star Wars will be a perfect example how cliche is not acceptable because of the rating. But then maybe something like Blue's Clues, or maybe Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or maybe Transformers, or something where kids are usually involved. Like, it can be Spider-Man. Spider-Man can be cliche because it's targeted at a younger audience generally. The films tend to be a little bit more mature, but the TV show is cliche. All those TV shows are cliche. So therefore, because the rating is low, therefore you have to teach kids. Well, you don't want to teach kids that life is too simple, but at the same time, you can't make it grounded on realism to basically shock the audience. So that's why cliche is here. I consider cliche as in the sense of making something too perfect. Whether it's negative or positive, it just happens too perfectly. There must be some kind of consequence in the journey. And the consequences is usually permanent, not temporary. Then, because if it's temporary, then that means there's no real consequence. It's just a slight discomfort, basically. The next term is saturation, when a concept is done often because it works, not because it's cliche, but a best practice. So generally speaking, there are best practices. So think of this like YouTube. In YouTube, there's best practices. Same thing with any other industry. There's best practices for everything, and especially YouTube. So when you want to do something correctly, you try to follow what successful YouTubers do. Same thing with movies. You want to follow what successful movies do because odds are you're going to be more successful if you follow in that footsteps. Same thing here. A lot of people will say saturation is a bad thing, but, well, saturation is just a way of saying that a lot of things are done in the same way, but often than not, it's usually best practice. And usually, when someone doesn't like something that's done often, it's because of the expression or how it's executed, and not so much what they have done. So keep that in mind. So there'll be a movie out there that's a love story. They'll say, "Oh, this is a stupid love story. It's the same thing over and over again." And then they'll like another love story, and it's the same thing, just executed differently. Because a love story is a love story, no matter what. But if you love one love story, not the other, there must be a reason why, and it's not because of saturation. Because both love stories will most likely have the same thing. Kind of like how every film adaptation or narrative has beginning, middle, end. Everything has that formula, but then the stuff around that formula makes it unique. So you're not going to say, "Oh, this is the same beginning, middle, end narrative. It's so boring." You got to think of it in the sense of why it's boring, not because of the elements in it. It could be the elements in it, don't get me wrong, but you have to get deeper into it. You can't just say, "Oh, it's just boring because of this." And when every other narrative has that, especially in that category. So you have to be more articulate of exactly what you're talking about. So most of the time, saturation is a good thing. It's more in the execution of that repeated concept that's being used often. The next one is reboot. When an established universe restructures the logic, look, and or anything associated with the IP to make it more modern to the time of the release, and just maintaining the characters' names and abilities. So in a reboot, it doesn't necessarily have to have the same look, the logic, and the only thing that a reboot has to maintain is basically the universe, or like the world it's in, that it takes place in, and the names and abilities. Everything else can change. Like the character's personality can change. And I find that a lot of people hate reboots, and they say it ruins the original. How can a reboot ruin the original if the original is still intact? But no one doesn't say anything about superheroes. Every superhero known to man has been rebooted multiple times, but no one doesn't say anything. But then for some reason, certain franchises or IPs, people get really sensitive over, and I find that really odd. And the only thing a reboot has to maintain is the abilities that the characters have and the names associated to those characters. Everything else can change. The look can change. The logic can change. Like how the origin stories can change. How they look. The race. Their genders. Everything else can change. Just the names and abilities can change. It could even be a transgender for all I know. And it would still be the same IP. So I just find it a little weird that people hate so much reboots, especially when it comes to like Ghostbusters. They changed the gender in Ghostbusters. Not sure if it's different or better than the original, but people hated the Ghostbusters just on the concept itself. And then this is not a movie, but Infamous 2's character model changed. People were upset because it was a young teenager, or they made the character younger, and people hated that. Why? I don't know, but people did. And they had to change the character's look. That's it. Just the look of the character. Because they associated with the first one, and people were okay with it. But if they went back to the old look, people wouldn't buy the game because of the look. And same thing with the new Power Rangers movie. There's a new Power Rangers movie. A lot of people were upset because they changed a lot of the things associated with the original. But then again, it's a reboot. So when you reboot something, you can change everything besides the names and abilities that the names are associated with the IP. So keep in mind that when something is rebooted, they're trying to make it more modern, as if it was released for the first time in the current era. And that's the whole point of the reboot. But a lot of people get upset because they change too much. They change the look. They change the personalities. That's kind of the point of a reboot. They reboot the franchise, meaning like they change everything. So like they can start from scratch. So maybe the original IP, they didn't want to go in a certain direction because they couldn't because of the logic. So therefore, in the reboot, they can put more stuff in it, or they can consider other aspects further down the line because they can restructure the logic. So therefore, a reboot is kind of like taking in what the last franchise did and what we couldn't do with the last franchise, or what they couldn't do with the last franchise, not necessarily me, but what they couldn't do with the last franchise. And with the new franchise, the reboot, what can they change in order to incorporate new elements in the franchise that couldn't be implemented in the first time because of the logics and the looks and whatever the reason may be, because it wouldn't fit in with that last one. But with the reboot, you can put more stuff in it because you restructured everything. So think of it like that. Or think of it like when someone has a kid, as the next generation, the kid can follow in the mother or father's footsteps, or they cannot. Like, it's not set in stone. Like, once something's rebooted, they can change everything. And I just find it funny that a lot of people get upset over that. The last one, spin-off, when a narrative takes place in the same universe from an IP, but is usually from a different perspective than the entailed characters from the IP it's from. So it could be from, let's say, for example, Power Rangers. It can be a spin-off from Power Rangers. It could be one of the characters, or it can be in that same universe as Power Rangers, but not necessarily involving the Power Rangers. The Power Rangers could be in the background, or the Power Rangers can be talked about in that universe, but it's not focusing on the Power Rangers, for example. So that'll be like a spin-off. And these are I want to talk about more concepts, but the video is too long, and so I just narrowed it down to these concepts, where a lot of people would talk about these concepts and say these are bad in a narrative when they're not necessarily bad. It's more on the execution of the narrative. Especially, I wanted to incorporate sequels too, because sequels tend to be a negative thing too as well. But I think these terms are good enough so people can somewhat open their eyes to why something's bad, and not necessarily because it's a sequel or a spin-off or a reboot or saturation or a cliche. It's something more. It's something different. Well, that'll be it for my basic narrative concepts. And this is part 2 of 2. And that'll be it.